Welcome to the Revenue Builders Podcast, a weekly show featuring B2B sales leaders and executives. Hosted by five-time CRO John McMahon and Force Management co-founder John Kaplan, the show goes behind the scenes with the people who have been there, done that, and seen the results. If you enjoy our content, please subscribe, rate, and review the show to help us reach more people. Revenue Builders is brought to you by Force Management. We help companies improve sales performance, executing the growth strategy at the point of sale. Find us at forcemanagement.com. Enjoy today's episode.
Welcome to the Revenue Builders Podcast. I'm John McMahon, and I'm joined by my friend and co-host, the big man, John Kaplan. How are you, Cap?
I'm doing really good, Johnny. Really good. Looking forward to this conversation today.
It's going to be fantastic. Cap, today we have a very special guest to discuss the ever increasingly important topic of client success. Allison was the Chief Operating Officer at Gainsight. She's been on the board of directors of eCompliance, Rainforest QA, Commvault, and DP Labs. Allison's currently the founder and CEO of the New Normal Fund. She's published hundreds of thought leadership pieces about customer success, and she's the co-author of the best-selling book, The Customer Success Economy: Why Every Aspect of Your Business Needs a Paradigm Shift. Hey, Cap, please help me welcome Allison Pickens.
Allison, great to have you. Thanks for carving out the time. I think this is an awesome topic to bring to our listeners, so thanks for coming.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
Hey, Allison, let's jump in, but let's start with a little bit of a history lesson. At least this is from my perspective, having, been in the software industry for a long time, just so we can ground everybody on why client success has become so increasingly important over time. So in the old model, companies sold a perpetual software license where the customer owned the software for life. And the customer paid a large upfront fee to own the software, and they paid a percentage of the license as an annual maintenance fee so they could receive basically software updates, which came out at that time like every 3 or 6 months, not like every day today. In that model, though, customer success was essentially what I call break fix. Something in the software was broken. The company was typically reactive, slow to respond to customer issues because customer support was viewed by a lot of CEOs as just a cost center to their business. And the companies believed that they had secured the customer, and then the customer felt captive, to the software vendor. Then the cloud came along and we moved to subscription, where customers gained more power because now they essentially rented the software on an annual basis. And companies now realize that these customers could leave them prior to the annual renewal. So now CEOs decided to put more of an investment in customer service to secure the renewals, reduce churn, and many companies even changed the name to the organization to client success or customer success. Now the software world's changing, from some subscription to consumption. Customer holds all the cards because essentially they can leave at a moment's notice. Because customers are billed only when they use the software, lights on, lights off, sub-second billing. Now, many, but not most companies are investing more in client success and even client advocacy. And as you state in your book, a fundamental shift has occurred and should occur in most of these companies where client success has gone from a job function to a company-wide movement. So can we start with, why customers now, have so much power versus before? And it's not just because we moved from subscription to consumption.
Absolutely. I think there are a few reasons. As you mentioned, you noted one of them, which is that the revenue model has shifted. And because you can't just sell a customer and ignore them after the fact, you actually need to pay attention to them in order to generate revenue for them later. You now need to invest in actually supporting them. So I think that, we go where the revenue goes. And as you noted, with the further shift to consumption-based pricing, you really have to care about whether the customer is using the product because the usage is your most important pricing lever. Adoption is literally equivalent to revenue. But as you noted, there are also other reasons why the power has shifted from vendors to customers. One of them is the rise of social media and people's usage of social media in a work context. People will comment on vendors that they like and dislike online. And negative comments can be amplified very quickly and broadly. Actually, if you have one unhappy customer, theoretically could take down your company to have, one negative tweet that's retweeted or quoted or, liked many times. And so I think that's one big reason. Another reason is that there's been a shift to working with customers in digital form. So if you're on a texting basis with your customers, which, many sales folks, customer success folks, even CEOs are, or if you're communicating with your customers in Slack channels, which companies increasingly are, customers expect instant responses in the same way they expect instant responses from their friends and their family members and their coworkers. So, with that kind of higher expectation for communication, there's also just a higher expectation for customer experience generally. So I think there are a few reasons for this. I think, these things in general have propelled a massive cultural shift to people feeling as though their vendors need to have their best interests at heart. People expect that they're buying something in order to get value. Increasingly, ROI can be measured as well. And so with more data on the ROI comes like higher expectation of proof of that ROI.
Right.
I think we're also seeing a big, shift toward free trials, freemium, in general, product-led growth, which means that people actually expect to get value even before they start paying. So things have been flipped in a number of ways.
And Allison, I don't think that most companies have really responded, to have a company-wide mindset on client success. And as you stated, so important. Why do you think so many companies are a little slow to respond to the critical role of client success?
It's interesting. A few years ago, probably around the time I wrote the book, I would have said there are still many companies that are slow to adopt customer success and realize how important customers are to generally company valuation. Nowadays, I would say that we're in the, late majority stage of the adoption curve of customer success, that actually if a company hasn't really started taking customer success seriously, they will probably be left behind in pretty short order. Nowadays, I work with a lot of venture-backed companies. I run a venture fund where I invest in SaaS companies across stages from seed through, Series C or D sometimes. And often I notice the first customer-facing hire will be a customer success person, not actually a salesperson. In part because founders already know the value of customer success, having seen it at their past company, and also because of this embrace of product-led growth where actually, you have customers before you have revenue. And so you actually need people who can pay attention to your customers and help shepherd them along the journey. So I don't see too many companies, at least in my world, not embracing customer success. I would say that there have been a few changes since I wrote the book. In particular, I think actually the fact that companies have embraced customer success as a company-wide imperative sometimes means that they don't invest in customer success as a function as much, because many functions across the company are more oriented toward customers than they used to be. Yeah. For example, if your product management team is very oriented toward building the roadmaps that it addresses customer value and concerns that customers have voiced, you may not need to invest in people as much who are perhaps creating band-aids for product efficiencies. So that might be actually a positive reason why some companies don't invest in customer success as a function as much.
I'm also seeing where, because there's been a lot of people with the break fix mentality out there that's still holding on to the title, of like VP of customer success, that some companies, because they understand that now this client success person needs to respond to the customer quickly, understand their situation, and also sell them, like cross-sell them, upsell them on other products, that I've seen some companies take a VP of sales and put them in charge of client success. And then they hire people that are kind of like a combination of a salesperson and a SE, technical person that actually has, really good sales capabilities. Have you seen some of that in the industry?
Definitely. Sometimes those teams are called account management teams, and you'll have a VP of account management who has a sales background, but sometimes, as you noted, they're called customer success teams. They also might be called the renewals team. There are, a variety of titles, but yes, in general, I do see that as quite common. I do think that there are sales type skills that some types of customer success people need to have. The art of persuading someone, helping to unify two different stakeholders' points of view if you're seeing conflict at your customer, helping to guide stakeholders along, a certain process of getting to value or coming to some sort of revenue related decision. I think that those persuasive skills have become useful in a different context.
Well, that's something else that you talk about in your book, that we have to move towards an organization that is giving customers and focused on the customer's business outcomes, not just having them buy the product, install the product, and hoping that they get their business outcome. We have to focus on their particular outcome. How's the implementation going, and are they achieving their business outcome?
I think that's especially true in this macro environment. Any CFO will tell you that they're looking more closely at the revenue the ROI that they're getting from every software investment that they've made. And, ROI is the outcome that customers are expecting. So, it becomes really important for customer success teams in particular to be able to explain the ROI that customers are getting. I'd say, even better than customer success solely being responsible for that would be, the company as a whole, as a vendor, orienting customers toward understanding their ROI story, and having different functions at the vendor be responsible for that. For example, some companies are actually putting embedding dashboards into the product itself that can showcase the usage that those customers have, the value that they're getting on various dimensions. And when you're logging into this product every day as a customer, and you're seeing the ROI that you're getting, you're reminded, right, on a more continuous basis and a self-serve basis, that you are getting value.
I was going to ask that because my experience with my own success with offerings has evolved from those people that can give me insights into how I'm using their products or services and what I could be doing to enhance outcomes are the ones that I gravitate to. So what have you seen of the evolution of kind of building those insights into the product? I think I've heard you say, or I've read in your book, it begins with an outstanding product. What have you seen in the evolution of that? Has it always been that way, that the insights were built into the product, or has that evolved?
I definitely think it's evolved. I think companies have realized that the product itself is a channel to the customer. Actually, in some ways, it's the most obvious channel, but historically, this, I guess, wasn't obvious to companies. They thought that these insights had to be delivered via human. But if people are logging into the product every day, especially if it's a sort of productivity tool, that's a great place for you to, showcase insights about ROI. And also, as you noted, help share best practices for customers to actually get value. I think that journey sort of started with in-app walkthroughs, right? Like companies like Pendo started offering these products where you could kind of click through a tutorial, maybe when you first signed into a product or when there was a new feature that was launched. And you still see these. I do think that much like with email marketing, people have some fatigue with in-app messaging. So I think its power has been diminished a little bit, but I think folks have, learned other types of ways apart from these standard walkthroughs to help educate the customer in the product. For example, companies like Airtable have templates, right, that they have, accumulated so that when you first log in, you can choose among the use cases that you have for that product and then not have to deal with a blank canvas to get value. So that, that's, I think, another form of in-product best practice sharing. And then also, I think another indication that communicating things through the product has become much more standard is that you're starting to see a whole category of embedded analytics being built. I mean, companies like Xflow and Inventive as well, companies that are, basically allowing the customers of their customers to see how they are using the product and, be able to improve the value that they're getting from there.
Yeah. That's one of the laws that you have in the book. I think it's, law number 5, which is relentlessly monitor and manage customer health. And you basically say that, vendors need to recognize that they're in the business of driving outcomes, and they also must shoulder the responsibility of change management at the customer.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But I had a question with that when I read that. So you also say in the book, customer health is to the customer success what sales pipeline is to sales, the predictor of future customer behavior. How do you monitor customer health? What is your definition of monitoring customer health?
It's a great question. When we started out at Gainsight, the customer health score was the metric essentially that we were evangelizing. It was likened to a lead score in the marketing or sales world. So the idea is that you wanted to be able to, as you said, predict whether the customer was likely to renew. And so you would have a score that would perhaps range from 0 to 100, where 100 is they are perfectly likely to renew and 0 is they're perfectly unlikely to renew. And that score would be calculated based on a number of other metrics like product usage, perhaps a recent NPS rating, whether the customer had outstanding support tickets or whether those tickets were severe in nature or had taken a long time to resolve. You can imagine all the different inputs you would have into whether, customers considered healthy or likely to renew. I think it's important as customer success has become more broadly understood as kind of a fundamental of a company's sort of nature as opposed to a particular function. It's become important to understand that there are different things to measure with your customers in order to understand how your business is operating. For example, the PQL or product qualified lead is a metric that is commonly adopted by particularly venture-backed companies, but also some public companies as well that have more product-led models. And the PQL helps you understand whether, users within an account that you have, perhaps like users that signed up through a self-serve method by swiping their credit card, sort of virtually on your website, whether those people are kind of indicate that account is primed for a corporate level contract. So you could imagine if you have a bottom-up model, you're having a bunch of users at a particular company sign up for your product. Maybe they're not really collaborating, but independently they're realizing that this is an interesting product. Then they start kind of working together through the product. They start using it more. And you realize that actually if, you sold to an executive level or, sort of central point of contact at that company, you could sell an even bigger contract size than what all these individual users are paying for. And you could in turn offer more value by enabling permission controls, better types of, invoicing and billing, visibility into what those customers are using. There's sort of more advanced features that an organization could benefit from that individual users couldn't. So the PQL is an example of not a predictor of renewal, but a predictor of whether there is this massive upgrade or expansion opportunity that's possible. And then separately, you might have, you might predict what the renewal is likely to be. And you also might have some kind of prediction mechanism for whether that particular customer account is likely to refer in other accounts, which of course is another source of revenue that you could have from your customers. So I think this original thought of a kind of universally valuable score for customers, I don't think that that's as relevant to how companies are operating nowadays, but it was a very useful foundation for building the customer success movement.
And don't you see more and more companies building instrumentation or telemetry into their products so that they can not only make the client success people more efficient because they can understand if this is, let's say, ideal behavior of a new customer that just bought our product, and now we see that someone's going off the ideal behavior, it may trigger that they're not using a certain feature, using a certain capability in the wrong way. It sends a trigger to client success. And now they know specifically, why they're calling the customer and what type of problem the customer's having? Are you seeing more and more of that in the industry?
Definitely. I think that's a very standard workflow at this point. And it's wonderful to see it, I think, so broadly adopted. And I think that's an example of sort of a real-time translation of data into action that doesn't necessarily speak to some kind of predictive score of some future revenue outcome. It's simply, we notice this behavior, now like take action right away. And that's really where you want to be operating as a company, is like in the moment helping customers, as opposed to thinking, oh, what exactly, is going to happen 3 months from now. Certainly you can change that outcome if you're responding in real time. And I would add to that, it's hard not to bring up generative AI in a discussion nowadays, because it really impacts like every industry and like all parts of our lives in a way. But with generative AI, many companies, many startups now are building on OpenAI's GPT-3, and perhaps, building other model or, building on top of other platforms as well, in order to surface, not just insights from all the data that companies are gathering on their customers, but also to be able to like crystallize those insights into talking points that a sales rep or a customer success person, might be able to use with their customers. So it's amazing when you can, have software that looks across all these data sources and doesn't just say, oh, this customer's usage dropped, you should intervene now. But it says, this customer's usage dropped, and here are, 3 best practices that you could recommend. And here's the email template that you should use when you email the customer. And, here are several other customers that are similar to this customer that were able to recover from that low usage. Why don't you reference those customers in your email as a proof point? So the fact that we're now able to translate, customer behavior into action, and also not just sort of prompt the action, but actually formulate the language that people can use. I mean, that's like a whole other level of ensuring great customer outcomes.
Yeah, and then when you can look across all your customers like that, that can also help further define the ideal customer profile, and maybe even you can figure out what new capabilities or products you may need, from that ideal customer profile across all your different customers.
Definitely. Yeah, I think that ideal customer profile, it becomes very important, especially for marketing folks or sales folks, and especially for early stage companies that are trying to figure out, what's working among my existing customers, and therefore what types of customers should I target as my sort of next, you could call it next bowling pin, to use the crossing chasm analogy.
What about in the book, you talk about kind of joint success plans and being very transparent with data and strategy. How much of this, of the insight that you're gaining about the customers, or what you're struggling with, or what that customer might be struggling with, how much of that do you, and how do you share it with customers as part of the plan?
I think in general, our society is leaning toward greater transparency. I think there's a general mistrust of authorities, of the vendors that are selling us things. And I think the more transparent you can be as a vendor, the better. I think actually it builds trust when you can say things like, we messed up. I remember one time, we at Gainsight, we had a customer, unfortunately, that was not getting value. Their implementation kind of dragged on, had a lot of false starts for different reasons. And some of those reasons were, not Gainsight's fault, if you could possibly make it a binary thing. But some of them definitely were our fault. We had not executed well. And my team and I, we got on the phone with the customer and said, we're sorry, we messed up. We want to make it up to you. Here's what we're prepared to do. We're going to dedicate these particular people. And on this time frame, we think we can get you from X to Y, but we need your help as well to do that. What do you think? And I think there was almost a silence on the other end, because they were so shocked that we admitted fault, right? Like, how often, 10 years ago, did you actually hear vendors say that? I think people know that other people are fallible, that they make mistakes. What's unusual is that they will have the humility to, admit to it. And I think that humility can really help build the trust that ends up building your business. So, besides admitting mistakes, which hopefully you don't have to do that often, you can share things like, again, how much is the customer using the product? What ROI has the customer gotten? Actually, in cases where the usage and ROI is pretty low, sharing it with the customer can actually be an opportunity to prompt them to action. Yeah. I've noticed a very successful tactic is to show a customer where they are in terms of benchmarking with other companies that are like them. If you say, well, you're in the bottom 25th percentile of companies like you and using our product, that is sort of implied that they could be getting more value because 75% of companies that are like them are getting more value than they are. So it inspires kind of a competitive spirit that ends up making the customer engage more with you and therefore helping them get more value.
Well, what's interesting about that, Allison, is that I think it's just human nature. When you make an investment in something to get an outcome, you are naturally inclined to ask yourself and the vendor, how am I doing against others? And I would say that, if you look, anybody listening to this podcast, you've all been asked before by your customers, how do we look in comparison to other customers? How is our ROI versus other customers? And I think it's just a basic expectation today.
Absolutely. And again, like I said earlier, there are software products that can help you, showcase that to your customers.
Yeah. Hey, on these laws, as long as we're on them, one of the ones that I found really interesting to me was that obsessively improved time to value is actually law number 8.
Yeah. I like that one too, Kev.
Yeah. Yeah. And for SaaS companies, it's the length of the subscription. And so I'd like you to talk about that a little bit, but then it just blew my mind when I thought about, what does that mean for consumption?
Well, even PLG though, Allison, also for PLG companies, they have to obsessively improve, time to market, time to value. Otherwise, if it keeps extending, customers are like, I'm just not getting any value here.
So what are the things people are doing? Start with subscription and then talk about the other models.
For sure. Yeah. Time to value is, as noted, one of the most important metrics I think you can have in customer success or at your company generally. And very interestingly, I've noticed time to values as metrics improving over the years. Nowadays, it's very unusual that I would talk to a company and they would say, it takes us several months to implement our software for our customer. And that's like very rare at this point. And probably would have more to do with like the age of company. If they hadn't adopted more modern software best practices, or might have to do with the industry. Like if you're selling into an industry that happens to be, have very tough implementations for one reason or another. But for the most part, I see time to values having massively improved. And I think it's a result of a few things. I think one is that products are just getting better. They're more easily usable. I think they're built more for the user than they used to be. They used to be built for the executive who was watching, looking at the demo. Now they're built more for the person who's administering the product and using it. I think also there are many more products that vendors can buy to kind of build into their tech stack. And so certain things that you might have had to do yourself, you now no longer have to do. A good example of that is integrations software. It used to be that you would have to hook up the integrations between all these software products yourself when you were trying to get a customer live on your product. But now you can buy software that automatically, allows you to build all those integrations kind of natively in your product. So, that I think all those things have contributed to better time to value. I think companies are also better at measuring it. And so they can learn how to get better at it over time as they, continue to grow. And I think they're more thoughtful about staffing up to ensure that there is, if needed, that there is a human supporting onboarding. So, definitely, I think it's an area you have to focus on. I would also say that there are other types of strategies that people have used to get their customers help. Having really strong product documentation is very important. It's important to keep it up to date. Increasingly, we're finding that the users of products are more technical than they used to be, even if they're not, actually developers or people who are necessarily in technical roles. They have more technical skills, which often means that they're more comfortable looking at product differentiation and answering their own questions. And I think the best companies think of documentation as a type of product in itself, where they release updates to documentation in a structured way. They think about the impact of a new release on past documentation, past documentation that was written, and ensure that it's kept up to date.
So what about communities, that they could reach, users could reach out to also, that can help support the product?
Definitely. Yeah, definitely community, I think, is a really important asset that companies have in order to scale the kind of help that they can give to users.
What are some ways
do you see most companies having that, Allison? What percentage of the companies you've run into actually have a community that will help, address certain workaround fixes?
I don't want to say negatively, but how do you control the community to make sure that you're guiding the community in a way? Yeah. Or is that a fallacy?
I think that that it's very common for large companies to have communities where people can ask technical questions. I think, increasingly in the earlier stages, I'm noticing users being more self-sufficient than they used to be, like using documentation. But definitely community is a valuable way to scale.
Now, the last thing on that question on obsessively improved time to value, is it just the same for consumption, or is there any nuances?
I think what is often true for companies that have consumption-based pricing models, although not always true, is that they have some kind of self-serve sign up where, individual users will sign up for a product, and therefore the onboarding is at the user's level, not an organization's level. And so, thinking about user level onboarding, it's often a different type of problem than company level onboarding. Company level onboarding, which used to be the norm, you would have to, get a bunch of different functions into a room to talk about what the project plan is and how you're going to manage this implementation. You might have like a group training at the end to get all the users into the room and train them on the product. Actually at Gainsight in the early days, we used to fly our customers' teams into a particular classroom setting where we would train them, right, on like how to use the product. But at the user level, it might be simpler in some ways, but also the expectations are very high. Usually user level onboarding is done again in a self-serve way using like documentation and, perhaps like some email correspondence. It is interesting to see that some companies find that there's a lift in their lifetime value of their users if they have a human in the loop, which for very product-oriented companies might initially seem kind of crazy. But Superhuman is one example actually of a very product-oriented company that found it valuable to have a 30-minute onboarding call for every new user with a person who would walk them through how to use the product. For those who don't know, Superhuman is basically like a super email inbox. And you can use keyboard shortcuts to do all the different operations that you normally would with your inbox. I remember going through this onboarding myself maybe 5 or 6 years ago when I first started using Superhuman, and was surprised that they bothered to have a human call me. But I could tell that they weren't simply satisfied with having a person on the phone with me. They wanted to make that person much more efficient in the way that they helped onboard me so that they could potentially, I imagine, shorten those calls over time, but then also increase the value of that call to me. In particular, they had their own sort of custom built product tutorial that person on the phone walked me through. So, the tutorial would say, okay, now practice creating a new email by pressing this shortcut. Now practice searching through your email using this shortcut. And it forced me to do the thing that, frankly, I might not have, as a busy executive, may not have bothered to spend the time doing on my own. So I think there's probably an accountability mechanism in having someone on the phone with users. There's also, just the benefit that you have of being able to ask someone questions, as you are going through a self-serve workflow. So, I encourage founders who are more technical to really think about, how can you use the right combination of humans and software in order to drive the highest LTV lift for your customers.
Yeah. Hey, Allison, do you think in your experience now that most companies actually can get down to the granular level of understanding the root cause of churn?
I think that some companies unfortunately think of it a little superficially.
Yes.
One way in which they might think about it superficially, one way in which they might think about it too superficially is they might note things, root causes that are outside of their control, seemingly, like the sponsor of our product left the company, or
Yes.
we lost to a competitor, or this company was acquired by another company. Well, those are interesting facts, but maybe don't speak to root causes that existed, but that were also in your control. When your customer gets acquired by another company, that is not an obvious churn or like an inevitable churn reason. Actually, it might be an opportunity to expand your deployment to the larger company that just acquired your customer. That might be the best thing that's ever happened to that account. So I think what's important about, these facts is how do you respond to them? And, it might be that you are, it might be that those customers are not worth saving. For example, you might find that you've sold to a lot of small business customers. It's sort of a fact of life that small business customers tend to churn at a higher rate. Many of them might go out of business or be acquired. You might decide that we no longer want to, focus on the small business segment. We want to move up market. And that's fine. And it might be that you made execution mistakes with those small business customers, but you might decide it's not worth it to try to improve that execution. I think what's important is just being honest with yourself about what you can improve and what you can't based on the strategy of your company at the time.
So when you look at just to educate our audience that may not understand how you measure churn, can you quickly explain the different ways in which people measure churn? And then also, which of those metrics tells the true story of churn?
Usually folks are measuring churn both particularly in the early days, but I think in general it's good to do this, both on a dollar basis and also a logo basis.
Yes.
The dollar basis is obviously very important because it maps back to your P&L as a company, and it's harmful when you're losing revenue. But the logos are also valuable to look at because it essentially says, here's the number of people that are unhappy with you. And that's an important number because especially if you're an early stage company trying to establish yourself, the more people you have out there that don't like you, the harder it may be for you to build positive word of mouth about your company and hire great people and also attract great investors and of course attract great customers going forward. So I think it's valuable to track both. Of course, people also track net dollar retention, not just gross retention. Gross retention is the inverse of gross churn. Net dollar retention says, well, you can make up in one way for gross churn by upselling other customers. So it might be that some of your customers stayed with you and they bought more from you over time. So you take the net of the churn and the expansion and you end up with net dollar retention. So gross retention can be up to 100%. Net dollar retention can be greater than 100% because you might expand more than you churn. Net dollar retention, I think, has become the gold standard for measuring revenue from your customers and how it's moving. I think generally people look at new logo revenue. Those are the new customers that you're bringing in. They're bringing in a certain amount of revenue. And then they look at net dollar retention, which is, if you brought in a new logo dollar how much were you able to expand that, say, over the course of a year? And, you'd say best in class net dollar retention is probably 140% plus.
Right.
But the problem with net dollar retention is that it doesn't tell the full story, because
that's where I wanted to go.
Yeah, right. Because you might have so many.
It masks a problem. It says you're doing great in your install base, or you're doing great with the customers that have not left you. But it's not talking about the customers that have left you and how fast your install base is decreasing.
Exactly. Yeah. And that decrease, even if you're making up for it in a sense of expansion, that decrease is a problem, because one, as I noted, you end up with more people out there who aren't happy with you for whatever reason. Two, you've lost a customer that you could potentially expand.
Yes.
So there's a missed future revenue opportunity. The fact that you're losing those customers might signal that something else is wrong. For example, your product might be deficient in some way, or maybe your go-to-market strategy isn't appropriate. Maybe you're not selling to the right type of customer. You need to change your ICP, your ideal customer profile. Perhaps there's some kind of execution problem. Maybe the fact that you're losing some customers points to misalignment between functions at your company that are expected to work together in order to ensure strong customer outcomes. So, if you're kind of ignoring that churn, you might be ignoring more fundamental problems that might handicap your growth as a company.
And you've seen it all over the map, as you just explained, for those different reasons, or do you see more of a common reason?
Yeah, I'd say the most common cause of churn in top-down companies, as opposed to sort of bottom-up, like more product-like companies, tends to be the loss of a sponsor. The person who was the executive that initially signed the contract leaves the company, and you're stuck trying to put together the pieces, working with the successor who might have a different perspective on what vendor is right for you. And, maybe if you didn't generate enough value for the users, there's not a more organic, like homegrown movement to support your company. So a loss of sponsor tends to be the most common. I'd say another very common reason is onboarding failed. So when we talked about the importance of onboarding, there are obviously other types of reasons that a customer might cite for why they would churn. I think as a CEO, though, if you're looking at your company and thinking like, what can I learn from churn? Your mindset should always be, how can I make the fundamentals of my company better? How can I create better product market fit, sell into a market that is ready to buy my product and has large budget, in particular, readily available? How can I improve alignment at my company? There's actually a blog post that I published, I think it was about a year ago, about it was entitled Talent Efficiency, but it spoke to 7 fundamental attributes of a company that if you've got them, it makes it much easier to grow your company into an $100 million revenue business. And as a founder, you should always be thinking about, in my opinion, those 7 things. Churn is one vehicle through which you can learn about how to improve those 7 things.
So when you say a company has to find a natural orientation around CS and the roles that you need to have to be successful in implementing CS, what do you look for? As it relates to product and marketing and sales?
I think a really interesting indication early on of whether a founder is naturally oriented toward helping customers is, do they talk about customer success stories in their pitch deck, right? Like, here are some logos of customers that we're working with, and here are some quotes that from those customers for, how they have gotten value so far, and maybe some statistics that those companies would mention in terms of the ROI of your product. Often I think sometimes CEOs, I think, are oriented toward, we got this like flashy new customer, but they may not be as oriented toward just like bragging about their customers initially to investors in terms of the value that they've been able to generate for customers. Other founders are, very keen on generating value well before they charge customers. And then, when they have these, what they often call like design partners, at some point, the design partner might say, hey, you guys are adding so much value for us. You're so core to what my team does at this point. We couldn't imagine living without you. Because of that, we have to have a contract with you. We have to start paying because I worry that without formalizing this, we might have to give you up, right, at some point. I get so excited for my founders when they start hearing that from customers. It's the ultimate proof when customers come to you and say, we have to start paying now. So that's another good indication of whether I think a company is really naturally attuned to customers. Another one, as I mentioned earlier, is that a founder hires a customer success person as one of their first customer facing hires.
Johnny, I have to ask the question. I got to get it in.
I have a couple more before we have to go.
Okay. I know that Allison has a hard stop. Where to align client success, customer success, the age-old question, because is it separate from sales? Is it part of sales? Pros and cons? Could you just bring us home on that?
This is a great question. I don't think there's a universal answer. And actually, although Gainsight, certainly we were selling into functions that were usually called customer success or client success, I'm not particularly biased toward that function. What matters to me, as we've been discussing, is whether a company in general is creating value for their customers, and different functions might contribute to that. As an example, as I'm sure you all know well, at Snowflake, there isn't a function called customer success. There's sales, and there are, I believe, solution architects, and they work together, I think, across the entire customer journey. That seems to work quite well. And actually at DBT Labs, where I'm on the board, they're an incredibly successful company backed by amazing investors like Sequoia and Andreessen Horowitz, and they're growing incredibly fast. They have a similar structure to that. They have account executives on the sales team working side by side with solution architects across the customer journey. What's important is the combination of skills that set of functions creates. You need to have someone who's covering stakeholder alignment, conversations where persuasion is important, someone who is really internalizing like the high level ROI that a customer is getting, someone who can work with executives at the customer. And then you need someone who's working with the practitioners, helping them be more productive with the tool, giving them tips on a technical level. And as long as you've got those two things covered, you should be fine in generating great customer outcomes. So I don't believe there's a universally right set of functions or org chart. I think what matters is that you're covering all of the quote unquote jobs to be done at your company.
And as you say in the book, injecting CS into the existing way that people work and our comp. So you're seeing more and more salespeople being comped on net new ARR, meaning if I bring in $1 million deal, but I lost a customer for 100,000, I'm getting paid on 900,000. And then they're aligned also to the compensation plan of the client success people. So then it's almost like you're forcing them almost through the comp plan. You're changing the behavior and almost forcing them to work together. Absolutely. So I'm seeing things like that. And then we talked about instrumentation in the product. And you're also starting to see some things that marketing is doing with marketing strategies around the data that they're collecting from client success to inject it into their organization also. So Allison, I know that you have to go. I know that Johnny and I feel like
we're going to have to invite her back.
The iceberg.
If she'll come back, we're going to have to invite her back. We're going to
have to lure you back somehow. But thank you so much for giving us and our audience such a, fantastic overview of client success and some of the elements of it. You did an awesome job. Thank you.
Thank you for having me. This is a lot of fun. You all ask great questions, and I'm happy to come back at some point.
Hey, Allison, let's just make sure we know, how do people engage with you?
I spend most of my time working with CEOs as a result of having invested in them. So I tend to be a COO thought partner to CEOs, pre-seed through, the later stages of the company. And they're welcome to, reach out to me. LinkedIn is probably the best way.
And you've got an incredibly successful newsletter as well.
Yes, I have a Substack. It's just called Allison Pickens newsletter. And folks are welcome to subscribe there for free if they'd like to hear about best practices from CEOs who are scaling their SaaS companies.
And of course, the Customer Success Economy, the book, Why Every Aspect of Your Business Model Needs a Paradigm Shift. Allison Pickens, you were awesome. Thank you for joining us.
Allison, you're a powerhouse. Thank you. And thanks to our audience for listening to another episode of the Revenue Builders Podcast.
Thanks for listening to today's episode. Be sure to check us out at forcemanagement.com.